Mixers. We all use them, usually only part of them. So that's usually mixers are, they come in all shapes and forms. And I think that what we're really focusing on here is not so much field mixers, but really mixers, console mixers that are larger. And really, what are the things that we want to consider when we start to look at what kind of mixer? There are many, many attributes to mixers, and many of them are good for one thing and not another. So Marty is going to take it away and kick off the conversation about what we think about when we start to think about buying a new mixer. Go ahead, Marty.
Hey, Alex, if you had to categorize and put it into a number, how many different types of mixers have you owned, or do you have currently?
Yeah, I mean, I probably have 4 to 6 different mixers right now that are completely different form factors, and I've probably owned 10 or 15 different form factor mixers that are all shapes and forms. Some that are fully digital, virtual, some that have a big console in front of me, some that are rack mounted, some that are field mixers, some that are so lots of different things.
Lots of different kinds of mixers out there. So how do we choose one over another? Well, I think we have to ask some questions because it depends. It's our favorite phrase here on Office Hours. It depends. What is your application, right? Is it a concert? Is it church? Is it school? Is it corporate? Is it going to be permanently installed? Is it going to be portable? Is it an ENG application where you need to carry this thing around and have it operate on batteries? Is it for filmmaking? Is it for music production? Is it for podcasting? What is your application? So what we want to do is ask some basic questions to set up some filters so that we can exclude certain types of mixers and just narrow down, get through the funnel and narrow down on what type of mixer do we really need, okay? So, what is your application? And then some other questions that you want to ask is, who is going to operate it? If not you, then who and what is their skill level and their ability to, or willingness or time availability to learn to operate this particular piece of equipment. And then we start to get into some of the detailed specifications, like how many inputs do you need, right? If this is for a desktop application, for you doing podcasts, then you have a microphone. Maybe you have a couple of analog inputs for another piece of equipment you want to bring in. When it comes to analog inputs, I would always determine how many you need and then add a margin to it, like 50%. So if you know you need 2 inputs, you get 4 or 6. Or if you know you need 10 inputs, get 15 inputs, because you always want to leave room for growth. There's a piece of equipment you're buying, but you're not buying it for today. You're going to buy this to use it for the next 6 or 10 years, right? So how many inputs? Then how many outputs do you need? What are you feeding this audio signal to, and are you sending out? Do you need to connect beyond the mixer? Do you need to connect analog pieces of equipment or digital pieces of equipment? Do you need a USB input or output? Do you need Dante, or do you need analog outputs? And how many, and what are they going to be used for? Because the next question is, how many mix buses do you need to have? So when we think of mix buses, we think of how many different mixes do we need to send? We have a main program output that may go to a computer for webcasting. You may need outputs for loudspeakers in a room. You may need outputs for different monitoring applications. If we have a stage, you may have floor wedges for people to hear certain things and not other things. In this case, I have a pair of buses that are just feeding my earbuds, because I want to hear things that I'm not sending to Zoom and that may not be playing on my loudspeakers. So I'm mixing them differently. So these are mix buses. Then, do you need any kind of effects? If you're doing music, if you're doing narration, if you're doing voiceovers, you may want to have a little bit of reverb available to you. So do you need effects? Do you need that USB bus to your computer? And if you do you need more than 2 channels? And do you need it to go in both directions? Do you need to send to the computer? Do you need to receive from the computer? Some of the smaller hybrid mixers, we'll get into different types of mixers, but sometimes there's just 2 channels and they just go from the main bus, and that's the only sends that you can have. Does it need auto mixing? So if you're doing, say, an event with a panel that's got a bunch of microphones on a table, or lavalier microphones, or even handheld microphones, do you want to have auto mixing, which makes your job a whole lot easier, because it will effectively turn microphones on and off as they're being used, so that unused microphones at any given moment aren't open to your loudspeakers. So it's enormously helpful. And how many channels of auto mixing will you possibly need? Some channels are limited in the number of channels. They may have 16 or 32 channels available in the mixer, but there may be only 8 that can be auto mixed. So you want to take a look at that. Do you need feedback suppression? So this is a really interesting thing, and a new development that for incorporating into a mixer rather than having a separate piece of equipment do it. Do you want the mixer to be able to record internally or externally to a different piece of equipment, whether it be hardware or a computer? Routing and patching within the mixer. So some of the more basic inputs, basic mixers have a series of inputs, let's say 16 analog inputs, and they will go to 16 faders on a one-to-one basis, and that's how they're set up. But other mixers, you can move things around. You can have input 8 go to your number 1 fader if you want to. And so makes things more flexible. As you move from one segment of an event to another segment of event, you may want to shuffle things around without actually repatching your connectors. You can move your inputs to different faders. Talkback. So this is an interesting possibility if you are working with a comm system, or if you're working with guests who may be remote. You may want to be able to, as the operator, as the audio operator, talk to those people offline, and that can be very handy to do within the mixer as talkback. And so there are a bunch of different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got questions already rolling in. We'll continue to discuss this, but go ahead and start throwing your questions in of what you're trying to figure out. And when it comes to choosing a mixer, let's go to the first question.
Roscoe Jones in Madison, Indiana has this one to start us off. How do you determine the quality of a mic preamp? Can it be determined from just the specs? Do you trust most manufacturers to be truthful?
Go ahead, Courtney.
Well, generally you can trust known manufacturers. That it's the no-name brands that are, the plain box Chinese made mixing levels. They tend to lie a lot on their specs. You want to, and because the big name manufacturers, people are going to hold their feet to the fire, and there's plenty of people out there who run tests on these mixers to see if they meet specifications. And you can determine the quality yourself. You can do a little test by making sure you put your mixer at unity gain, and you put a 150 ohm resistor across pins 2 and 3 of a mic input. You don't connect a microphone to it. And then you measure it muted and unmuted with it open at unity gain or maximum gain if you want to see what the maximum noise, self-noise is of that preamp. Then you bring it into your workstation, you blow up that waveform, and you look at the difference between that channel muted and that channel unmuted, and that'll be the self-noise of that particular preamp. Typically, you want to have greater than 60 dB of gain. 60 to 75 is good, especially if you want to use dynamic microphones. But of course, the higher the gain of the preamp, the more the noise is going to figure in. And usually you want about minus 130 or more dB of self-noise. It has to be below, minus 130. Otherwise, you're going to start to hear it. It's going to deteriorate the more you amplify that mic channel.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I would just say there's like a massive spectrum with preamps, and I don't know if anyone saw the interview that I did prior as a guest. I'm talking quite a bit about that stuff on that, but think of your preamp is like, it's like a personal life coach to the microphone that it's powering, right? And the better that preamp is, the better the support and the better load bearing it has for that microphone, right? The more it can accept loud sound without just without artifact, without, there's a whole series of bad things that can happen in microphones. And preamps and microphone combinations, all these things, you can obviously, there's a ton of different color choices that you can get into. So it's like an endless sea of option. What I would say is when you're getting microphone preamps, look for Class A circuitry. So Class A means that essentially that within the unit internally, it's powered at every stage within the wiring. And so it's just a specification quality level essentially when things are rated as Class A. And I mean, you've got API, SSL, Rupert Neve. You've got, there's a ton of options that make really, really great selections with a lot of feature sets. So I would say with preamps, look, because a lot of these will come with like a 1/4-inch DI maybe as well. You might be getting other tools, other things. Maybe an EQ may come with it. There's a lot of options out there, but understand that like my friends have the greatest preamps in the world, the best stuff ever made. This stuff can be 12 grand a channel, right? It can get insanely expensive. So like understand that $500 for a preamp is not expensive. It's just not a lot of money, so you're gonna easily fall up into more, the $2,000-$3,000 a pop range for these really high-end things. You can get channel strips where you have full feature sets of EQs, compression, whatever. So just kind of look around. It really depends on what you need.
Yeah, and Craig Kadoki says that every manufacturer fudges the specs, but there is way more to the sound of a mic pre than most specs can describe. A lot of times, I think that in the end, you want to have either a good relationship with the reseller or be buying from a reseller that has a good return policy. You're going to look at a bunch of things. And again, these are different. You can have dedicated preamps, but when you're talking about mixers, you are looking for a mix. What mixers have great preamps? And those are expensive. I remember talking to a manufacturer that had, I think it was eight of them. And they said each one, the OEM cost for each of these preamps was $50 in a field mixer. And so that there's $400 that they're paying that doesn't even go to you, that is just for the preamps. And obviously it goes with the ones that Chris was talking about. It's way more than that, but it's how that preamp is built, how it all is wired up, and it gets very expensive very quickly. So, and I will agree. I think all of us agree that preamps are a pretty big deal. And it's probably one of the more expensive, one of the more important parts of your mixer. You're not going to get these really, really high-end ones that Chris is talking about from a mixer typically. It's not what it's built for, but you do want to pay attention and read up on what kind of quality of preamps that you're actually getting. And that's a difference, for instance, and sometimes they point you towards things. I know Dave Rat was talking about has tested some different mixers with preamps and noise floors. And Dave Rat is a great person to follow when it comes to stuff. But one of the things that he did, which I thought was really interesting, is he took a Midas, a Behringer X32 and a Midas X32 and opened them up, and it wasn't just the preamps. it was like a lot of wiring had changed between the two. So it can kind of point you towards a different direction. Let's go to the next question.
Next one comes to us from Bradley Perigo in Wakefield. What small fader mixer, minimum of 8 channels, would you suggest that would facilitate mix minus via USB? Or would you suggest embracing a digital mixer driven by an iPad?
Go ahead, Marty.
Well, mix minus can be accomplished on pretty much any mixer that has mix buses. You don't need a mixer that features it specifically. What they are doing is taking the telephone channel or your broadcast channel and actually doing a phase flip with the inputs to cancel out the signal you don't want, which is a kind of an odd way to do it. It can work, but if you just work with a mix bus and take out the channels you don't need, that's a much better way to do it. But as for small format mixers, there's a bunch of them that you can look at, as long as it's got enough mix buses that you can output to where you want to go and do a mix minus manually. That's a great way to do it.
And the question is also what kind of inputs. So is it all going to be XLR inputs? Is it TRS inputs? Is it a mixture of both? So like, for instance, James Haldane says the Flow 8 is a budget option and has faders, but you'll need a tablet of some kind to use it. And it's not the best quality, but the Flow 8 is one option. Alan Heath makes a CQ12T, which I've seen at some like bands that are setting up, for live remotes that probably has those features. It's got a little touch screen. It's got a bunch of inputs. XR18s, and there's the MR18s, which might sound a little better. These are Behringer ones. And now that one doesn't have sliders. But the thing you want to think about is, do you really want the sliders connected to the I/O as well? So this is just a whole nother, to open up another strand here, is that I prefer mixers generally to not have all the I/O going into the back of them. So I like my mixers to be, I prefer control surfaces, to be honest, that are completely separate from where the I/O is, because then I can rack, Marty, your mic's open. I can rack I can put all my audio I/O in a rack. And so I use a lot of, like, for the basic stuff that we do, I use a lot of X32s, but a lot of times we have some kind of stage box. So we use Rios with the Yamaha systems. But the idea is that everything is off somewhere, and there's just an Ethernet cable back to what I'm actually running, as opposed to having to run all that audio cables to a desk. And especially when we're setting up quickly, that starts to make a difference, because we put those into road cases, and that road case shows up, and all the analog is all in the road case, and I'm just running Ethernet out to control it. So think about what your needs are and whether you want all of it to go into the mixer or whether you want to control it and have it somewhere else. Go ahead, Marty.
Right. So yeah, it depends. If you're working in a live event situation, I always prefer a digital stage box, because then I'm only running one wire to the stage for both my inputs and my outputs to loudspeakers and such. You mentioned the Alan Heath CQ12, which has, I think it's 4 inputs, but the CQ18, which I had a chance to work with a little bit recently, it's an amazing little mixer. Technology in this is absolutely wonderful. Although with it's a touch screen, and the buttons and knobs that you see flanking the left and right of the screen, they're all soft keys and buttons that you can program to do different things, and have them change when you're looking at different screens. The one thing I didn't like about it is that it's not a tiny screen, but it does require a lot of navigation from screen to screen to make certain adjustments. It also is a Wi-Fi device, so you can use it with a tablet. And that was one of the questions is, would you suggest embracing a digital mixer with an iPad? In some applications, I think that's perfectly fine, as long as the Wi-Fi in the unit is reliable, or you go to an external network where you have a reliable connection to the mixer. In some cases, that's not the case, so that's why I mentioned that.
And another thing is to think about when you're thinking about a mixer is thinking about what the I/O is going to, what I/O do you need? In some cases, you need inputs and outputs to be analog, but a lot of cases you may need an USB connection to your computer. And for most of us, like for me, I don't really buy, field mixers I'll get, and even field mixers I'm a little tweaky about, but almost all the mixers that I use at this point have to have a Dante option. Like I have to know that I can put Dante into the mixer, whether it's a card or whether it comes with it or other things like that. I don't really consider a mixer for me viable without some way to get it into Dante built in. Otherwise, just the rest of my whole pipeline. So you just have to think about those kinds of things. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about the minimum 8 channels may be stumping me, but the Rodecaster Pro 2, which is what I'm using, has I think it only has 4 mic preamps, but it has multiple channels it's a digital mixer, and it has mix minus that's very easy to use. And the fact these podcaster type mixers have multiple headphone outs. You see them up here that are controllable, and you can adjust mix minus to each one of those headphone channels independently. And it has an internal digital routing matrix. So instead of having to deal with creating your mix minuses on an analog aux bus, whereas if you wanted to create 8 inputs with 8 mix minuses feeding back to those 8 inputs, you would have to have 8 aux buses or 8 monitor buses in order to do mix minus for each one of those 8 channels. So that's a lot of knobs on a mixer, and they haven't made a lot of those analog mixers with that many aux outputs in a long time. So a digital mixer is probably the best way to go. It's more compact. You can go into that LCD screen on the Rodecaster Pro and modify all of your inputs and outputs and route them the way you want, whether they're mix minus or not. It's easily selectable. So a digital mixer with built-in touchpad LCD control is the way to go. That way you don't have to worry about your Wi-Fi connection to your iPad for external control. Plus, like the Rode mixers do have Rode Central, which is a companion app that runs with it, and as long as it's connected to the same computer that the Rode is connected to via USB, you can then control the mixer itself from the app over from your computer as well.
And there are some advantages to an analog, and not analog mixer, but analog controls, in the sense that it's really hard to bring a bunch of things up and down and organically move back and forth with a touchscreen. And I think that that's I think that we get into, being able to pull a bunch of things. There's something about that. Now, another thing that I don't know if we really touched on is knowing whether you're using motorized faders or not. So motorized faders are pretty important to me. so I needed to because it's connecting to something on the other side, and I need to know that it can do that, because there's a couple different things there. One is being able to remember settings. So I'm going to remember where I went, and that can be automation, that can be just a setting, it could be scene settings, it can be a lot of other things, but knowing that they're going to go back to where they were and they're going to show me that is pretty important to me. So motorized faders are something that I consider a pretty high priority, in that process. But analog faders, again, I can, I have a friend who has a mixing board that is 128 channels, and it's all analog sliders. Actually, John's been on the show, so John Ross has it, and he goes, it's pretty long. He's got big chairs that roll back and forth between them all. And I asked him, I was like, can you do, because he's very tech forward. So I asked him if he could do this and he had done things with touch screens and everything else. And he said, there's just something about watching things and being able to roll over and know that this is the section. And I'm sitting there looking at it, and I'm not looking down, and I'm sitting there working with it. That is much different than having it be something that's on a touch screen. And remember, you don't need to buy a mixer with a touch screen. You just need to buy or with analog controls. You need to buy one that can talk to something. So, for instance, we use X Touches all the time. So the Behringer X Touch is a really popular one, but there's lots of them. Icon makes them. A lot of other folks make it with motorized faders. They'll talk to your DAW. They'll talk to your mixer. They'll talk to a lot of other things, and they'll still represent what you're looking for there. Yeah, go ahead, Marty.
Yeah, that's just what I was going to mention. You can have an entire software mixer like the LAWO mixer or any of the others that are entirely in software, but have them controlled by physical faders on a control panel.
And what's really nice about control surfaces is that, again, it depends on how the clutter of what you're doing, but having a mixer somewhere and then having your control surface in front of you and just an Ethernet cable, sometimes even a PoE just goes out. It just cleans up your desk a lot as far as managing what you're trying to do there. So just kind of think through that. And again, we had Llama on last week. We're going to probably have on Hertz on somewhere in the near future. I think that we are going somewhere where we start to do software mixers. The thing that scares me about software mixers is how often I've been on a show where the Waves mixer crashed, and then there's like 20 minutes of us like so that's the only thing that it's really powerful when it's running. Just when it's not running, it's not nearly as powerful. Next question.
Next question comes from Matt Cool in Montreal, Quebec. Is there an 8-channel digital mixer with faders? I can't find one, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who would buy one. Go ahead, Chris.
It really just depends on your application. So, I mean, here in my studio, I have like an 8-fader packet, an Avid Artist mix. It's just 8 motorized faders, and then I have an Avid dock with a single fader and just kind of more of a master section on it. But in that kind, like if you're in a studio, you could just have an interface. You could have an 8-channel control surface, just like these guys were talking about, and that could be like just a really streamlined option. If you're out doing things live, I would probably look at like an X32 compact or an M32 compact, the R, and you can I think it's 16 faders on it, and I think you have a local 8 preamps in the back, so you don't need any kind of external stage box for that amount of inputs. And again, like just like Alex was talking about the flying faders and all this stuff, like this stuff, if you're getting like, that's the reason people go digital. It's for the recallability, it's for the convenience, and from like pressing one button and going from this band to this band or whatever the need is. But I would just say as you're going through, there's certain feature sets like that are really paramount. And if you're actually going to go and buy a digital mixer, make sure that you get something that has at least the basic real necessities, because I promise you will grow into it. Your needs will expand once you have the option for expansion. And it's something you want to make sure that you get. It's like when you buy a laptop and it's hardwired RAM. It's like, get a little more than you need now, because your future needs, that might save you a whole new computer. Because the one you have is going to just like extend into that, and then you're not buying something twice. So that's what I'd say about that.
Great, Courtney.
And it really depends on your budget. I mean, you can go Chris's way and spend $12,000, $13,000 on an 8-input digital mixer that has flying faders and Eve or something. Yeah. Or
if you have the resources, I so recommend it, as Ferris Bueller would say.
Yeah, but if you're like me and you can't afford that money to spend, there's something like the Zoom 8-track L8 8-channel digital mixer. It also has a recorder built in. This is, under $400, and it has. It only has 6 mic pre's, but it has more than 8 inputs, and you've got physical sliders on each input. They're not flying faders by no means, but it's a digital mixer internally, and so and as you punch up each channel, you've got these. The blue area in here is basically the control for whatever channel you have punched up. So you have these controls with these little LED readouts of what the levels are for each channel when you switch to it. So that's their solution for keeping track of setups and saving setups.
Have their preamps gotten any better for those mixers?
Zoom's has gotten better preamps on the, I don't know about the L8. I haven't looked at the specs of the L8, but they haven't been great in the past, I understand. Yeah.
Not great is the understatement of the world. Like it was like the Zoom mixers. I'm not talking about the F series that you use and a lot of other folks use.
The F series is actually pretty good.
They're pretty good, but the mixers, they might have, when I bought into Zoom early and then in the middle and then not after that, because the mixers themselves, the preamps on them were horrendous, like there was no headroom. I mean, they would literally, there was no padding at all. They would just distort, it was just a disaster. Like I couldn't even use them for home projects. Like I just, it was, so hopefully they've gotten better. One thing that was pointed out by James Haldane said, a Yamaha DM3, and DM3s are pretty popular within our community. Has 8 faders and 22 channels. Ideally, you want to buy some extra channels so you can easily run out of inputs. Douglas said that I own one myself and love it, but there are some gotchas of not being able to cue stereo linked channels, DAW control mode only speaking HUI, and stability issues with the DAW control. So if you're doing DAW control, so Roscoe pointed out that one drum kit can be 10 mics. So when you think about number of inputs, just know that they run out quickly. Go ahead, Chris.
I forgot to say also another really, really just like top tier option is the sound devices stuff. It really, as far as I know, it's pretty
as a field mixer. Yeah, I mean it's
just depending on what people's needs are, because I don't know the context of the question, and I know they do come with some mixer, some actual like fader pack options with their like hard disk. So
it is. I mean, I have a Scorpio that I use in the field. I have some mixed pre's. And I've been using sound devices for the last 15 years. And I've mixed whole shows, there's so much routing inside of the larger mixers. I would mix whole shows that are pretty complicated in 788s, and the same thing with the Scorpio. It's not so much that it can't do it; it's just trying to figure out where it all is in this little screen. But you're right that there are breakouts where you have control surfaces that can do a lot of that. I just want to say it's a lot of money for if you're doing live shows. It's a lot of money for something that isn't really what it's built for. But it does do it.
Well, and I don't know if it was live, sure. And I was thinking more of just like they're incredibly clean preamps. So the
preamps are negative 128 dB or whatever.
Like ridiculous. So.
Like ridiculously clean. Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Go ahead, Bill.
So, and I just want to emphasize the horses for courses thing, because I was talking to Chris actually before the show in the pre-thing, and I mentioned the fact that I had been in Chicago once. I went to Taste of Chicago. So, he's in his room looking at the very highest end because he needs that. He's that pristine sound and is willing to chase it and spend for it. That afternoon, my wife and I wandered to Taste of Chicago that happened to be going on at the same time, and I find myself next to Emeril Gassi, who's about to go on stage to do his presentation, and I looked over because I'm always curious. And there was an old Mackie 1604 over there and a couple of speakers on poles, and they gave him a headset mic, and it was a fabulous experience. That was all that needed to be done for that environment, for that thing. Chris would never use any of those things to any of the work that he does, but Emeril spending money to get that kind of high-end preamps into something that just can't use it is equally bad. So horses for courses, again, you got to find your level and do the right thing for the level that you're working at.
Next question.
Next question comes from Edward Johnson in Minco, Oklahoma, looking for a 6+ input mixer with clean preamps and USB interface, built-in recording, and a TRRS input is a plus. What do you recommend for small band performances and multi-person interviews?
Good, Marty.
Well, there's a lot of these types of mixers available. You've got the X32, the compact. You've got the rack units. You've got several choices from Allen and Heath. There's the QC, the SQ, the QU. I'll go back to the CQ18 that I showed earlier. You can get them from Personas. You can get them from QSC. You can get them. There's the Yamaha TF. It all depends on the budget that you have. But they're pretty basic requirements and features that very popular range for mixers right now.
And go ahead, Chris. Oh, you got Chris. Did you hear?
So sorry about that. Yeah. My apologies, guys. So one thing I would say is, again, I was going to go back to the sound devices for that of just trying to find something that is really just super clean.
If it was multi-purpose interviews, I would absolutely, that's what I use, the sound devices tools. I think when people say small band performances, I will say, even though it has some of the tools, getting to them in a way that, from a price performance perspective, getting to what you need. And this is, I will say, this is what the DM3 was really built for. Like, this is the Yamaha DM3 was built for exactly what you're talking about if you can afford it. So at $1699 or $1999, that is what it was built for. But it's also what the Allen and Heath were built for, and they're in the $899 to $1299 range, of those. And so, I would look at for what you're talking about, I would probably lean toward the Allen and Heath or the DM3. As those. Now, what do I see the most? X32s. I mean, X32s are everywhere. Like I know Mickey will complain about them, but every band that I walk into, you just look down and there's an X32 sitting there, because it is this, especially the rack mount ones, because they can rack them into their system. They can build. It's the X32 rack is the one. There's a TF version. There was something about the TF version that was missing, that why we didn't choose it. But
does the X32 internally record? Because that was one of the questions, part of this question.
I
don't think it does.
Yes, it can. Yes,
it can.
It can. Yes.
I've never.
But it's two-channel. So there's the two-channel. There's two-track built into to a USB plug, but you can get the plug-in card, which is called a live card, and that'll record all 32 channels internally to two SD cards at the same time.
Yeah, and that's a behavior. Admittedly, that's behavior that I don't have very much. Is having my mixer record is not something I think about that often, so I skipped that part. So anyway, were you going to say something else, Marty?
I forget.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I would say I've done just a ton of this. Just as I was primarily just doing live band concerts, and frequently these bands want to record. I would say for anybody that's looking at mixers, like pretty much all digital mixers give you this option now, and it is such a powerful tool to be able to go in and do full multi-tracks of your events, of bands in literally every situation. People need to realize that like you can easily add on just like an additional fee for handing out multi-track recordings for your live events, for things like this, and all you have to do is have an extra laptop. So the way that most of this stuff is, if people are not real familiar with it, and there are a bunch of different protocols for this stuff, frequently, right, you've got your digital mixer, say it's USB into your laptop, you're just using Pro Tools, you're using some kind of DAW.
Or even Reaper.
There's Reaper, and actually Live, I believe it's called, is just it's essentially just like a digital tape machine. It doesn't edit or do anything. It's free. All it does is record and play back. And a lot of people will do this actually for virtual sound checks because it's real easy. I mean, if they're not using something like Pro Tools or whatever, just as a free app, a free software, you can capture something. If you're a touring band, let's say, you have the same microphones every night, you have the same everything everywhere you're going, you can easily go into a spot and just do a virtual sound check because your gain, everything, your settings are all the same every night because you set them and you're bringing the desk with you. So in a situation like that, you can actually go into one of these spots, into a venue, into an arena, whatever, and do a virtual sound check from the night before or whatever, get things set up. The band walks out and you switch over to the live inputs, and you're kind of like, you might be 80% there, just to start. But it's such an important feature set, and it's just, you're gonna be able to get that everywhere. So I would just make sure that you're getting a mixer that definitely does have that, and that you really want to make sure that your preamps on your mixer are as good as you can afford, because that's the quality here. Okay. It's the preamp. Usually it'll go from the preamp straight into the recording. And if there is an option to record things with EQ and compression, all that stuff, you want that off, because you absolutely do not want, whatever you did in that room is not what you want. You want raw audio later. So that's a really that could be the difference of something being completely unusable or super fine to start with in a post-production scenario. So
Yeah, go ahead, Marty.
So can I talk about the value of recording for just a moment? Certainly not everything needs to be or even deserves to be recorded. Whether it be interviews, whether it be music performance or anything. However, you never know when magic is going to happen. And look, I've done a lot of work with houses of worship, and I was working with one particular church, and I just recorded everything. Didn't matter what it was. Every service, every special event, everything got recorded multi-track. And a lot of stuff we just never used. However, during the pandemic, all of those recordings were pulled from the library and used. It was so valuable for that particular church because people wanted to, as a way to keep people together. They did a half an hour before every service. The assembly was listening to all these things that happened in their church, and it just became very people appreciated it. But also, as things happen, people come and go. A number of our performers happen to die off, and having their performances to use and to remember and to give to family members, that was really, really, really valuable. But, even for just band performances, you never know when magic is going to happen on stage. And, maybe you won't use it, maybe you will.
Good, Courtney.
And you might want to look for one that does recording that records 32-bit float, because that way you can record ISO channels without having to watch the levels too carefully. Because if they've got dual A to D converters and 32-bit float recording, you can record them pre-fader, and that even if you forget to fade something up in the mix for your 2-channel recording, you still have the ISO that you can go back to, and you're not going to worry about it going over and splattering or being too low. Because the range of that 32-bit recording is handy to have. The Zoom F6 is a 6-channel input with 32-bit recording. It also has auto mix thrown in, which is great for if you're doing multi-input interviews. Has 6 really decent mic preamps in it that are actually pretty good. It's small and compact, but it's portable and runs on batteries and can do all the things you ask for, but it's not easy to adjust those levels if you're trying to do a live mix.
Yeah, it was pointed out that DM3 doesn't have an auto mix, which is a bit of an issue if you are for those round table type discussions. You definitely, if you're doing it live, you definitely need that. The other thing when you think about recording, Boom Recorder is a Dante. You can just do Dante to your laptop and record it. And we had some issues with the M1, but outside of that, I think that's all been fixed. And then what we use in our studio, is Jocos. And so these are not a mixer, but it's just a recording unit, and it works really well. So you can plug something in, and the Joco just makes it go away. And I learned about those from people who were doing band work. And they you can just record all the channels here. So I would also take a look at that. And they have many different versions, everything from AES to analog to Dante. Ours is Dante, but you can do a lot of different things there. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's up next. I remember reading about a Game Creek video truck that used German manufacturer LAWO, LAWO infrastructure, but a Calrec mixer. Would that be because the LAWO MC2 isn't as dominant in the U.S. as it is in Europe?
Marty?
Well, I can't speak to this truck directly, but there are a number of factors that go into this kind of a choice. One of them would be training of the operators that use it. So there's a core group of A1s that a production company would use or a truck would use. If they don't know the LAWO system, if they're more comfortable with the Calrec system, that would be one consideration. Another is that these companies have deals with the manufacturers, and they may have gotten a particular deal on a Calrec mixer that LAWO wasn't able to meet. Infrastructure and matching, different pieces of equipment, that is important. LAWO, both LAWO and Calrec have complete ecosystems for ingesting, processing, and outputting audio, and in cases some video as well. So there are a number of choices. Who knows?
And a lot of times when you talk to the mixing engineers, especially when it comes to broadcast and events, they're pretty sensitive to how it's laid out, how the mixer's laid out, and what gives them so if you talk to someone, for instance, about a CL5, the way that the CL5 centers a lot of the controls is something that for events a lot of people want. Calrec is really built for broadcast, so it is built as a broadcast mixer, and it really shines when it gets put into a truck because there's a lot of them, and this is something that's very, very deep in their understanding of how to set this up so that a truck engineer can run it. So I wouldn't find that to be remotely odd for a Calrec mixer to end up being the front end, because you remember you have to go to a lot of locations with a truck, and you got to find people that can use it. So people try to get something other than EBS for playback, except that where are you going to find the operators? A lot of this comes down to not even just the deal or the technology, but how many people do you have available to you to run that mixer? Because usually for these kinds of broadcasts, the layout of the mixer is going to be very complex, and someone really has to have years of. It's not just like, oh, they can just sit down and start playing with it. Most of the time, for a lot of these, they have years and years and years of experience with that infrastructure, and so almost every truck that I've gone into has a Calrec. Large truck, and so it's a pretty common thing to have there. Next question.
Robin Cutshaw's up next from Atlanta, Georgia. Have you ever had an X32 mixer fail? Do you keep a spare to swap in? How do you manage your mixer config backups for recovering?
Go ahead, Chris.
I would just say everything can fail. So that's the first thing when you're buying anything anywhere in any environment, it can break, right? If it's got tech support, it can break. So it just really depends. Again, this comes down to budget. The way to really make sure that you're going to be cool is you have a backup spare console, right? And now that obviously means a whole duplicate. Most people do not have that. I'd say most people really don't have that. as far as just like configurations and all this, all of these consoles all have show files. Okay. So there's a whole menu system in pretty much all of these desks. And this is how touring engineers that aren't bringing consoles with them, this is how they operate, because they can essentially have their USB key, and wherever they're at, there might be 10 different consoles that they're regularly seeing on their 6-week run or something. But after you do one show on those, the next time you're on that desk, you're loading that show file up, because it could give you all your labeling, maybe just like your tool set, the things that your parameters you want to start from. So it just really depends in what the type of mixer is, because these are all completely different languages, right? So they're not interchangeable at all. And that's one thing about it, where you kind of have to, like, if you are someone who's touring using lots of stuff like that, you're going to like just acquire a nice portfolio of show sessions. If it's just you and you're just you're the only one using this, you still want to have copies of all that just for backup. I mean, because if your console dies, it's a USB key on a new desk, and you hit load, and it's all back, and that's it.
Good, Marty.
Now the X32 has pretty good storage of configuration storage. There's scene files, there's a show file which contains all of the scenes, and then there's a lot of smaller files that you can store presets from EQs and effects and things like that. You can store them in the mixer. You can store them to a USB drive that you plug into the mixer, and you can store them on a laptop that's connected over the network. And if you're using any of the remote control softwares like the Xedit or Mixing Station, you can record the scene files and the show files from them as well, and be able to restore them both to the software and to the mixer.
The X32 faders are notoriously fragile. So it's not so much that they fail, it's that they don't handle rough management very well. So it just depends on, you have some engineers that will kind of slam on faders a little bit, and they won't survive that for very long. A lot of things we found will last a long time if you take care of them, turns out. But it turns out we call soft hands, like you just have to have. I always try to explain to people, we used to have a warehouse, about a 10,000 square foot warehouse full of gear. And I have to teach everybody in the thing, like, the last inch is what matters. Like, you can set it down, but then just stop an inch above and then just lower it down nicely. It's the constant banging, and then people hitting sliders hard, or people putting in cables really hard, tend to wear things down. And things that are less expensive, like the X32, tend to be more fragile because they just didn't spend as much money on that component. The thing that fails the most on the X32s is the power supplies, and we've definitely seen the power supplies, and the wait time for the power supply to get fixed has been, in our case, up to a year. Like, just so you know, like that. So if you're using an X32 in a show that matters, you should have two of them. Like, it's, like we use them as a glue in a lot of places, and we almost always have an extra one floating around. But it's the power supply that has been the biggest problem for us. Go ahead, Marty.
Yeah, I've been actually very fortunate. I use a lot of X32s. One of the production companies I work with has 2 or 3 compacts, and I've installed them in a bunch of places. I have not had one totally fail on me. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. But one of the things the thing that I find that most frequently fails or gets wonky are the encoder faders that are underneath the screen, the soft encoders. As you start turning them, they don't adjust as well. Whether you turn them slowly or you spin them faster, what they're supposed to adjust gets a little wonky. So those encoder boards need to be replaced. That's the thing that I've found is most troublesome.
And as part of the backup, we're just in the beginning of this, but we're really looking at, as backup to our mixers, we're really looking harder and harder at these. That's one of the reasons we're bringing them onto office hours. We're looking harder and harder at software mixers as the backup to the hardware mixer. So the software mixer is built so that all I have to do is everything's being routed into it. Everything's being there. I don't want another piece of hardware, but I want something that I feel solid. And I think that at some point we're going to end up with software mixers, that are just software based, like the Llama that we saw, or On Hertz, or many of these other mixers, where we are mixing shows in software. I think that what's interesting about that is eventually, and I've become a little obsessed with this because of some of the stuff I was doing with Mimo Live. Eventually, we're going to start, for a lot of these shows, you start to want to abstract the interface. I don't need to have a traditional interface. We're kind of hung into that right now because we have a lot of traditional engineers that really want it to look the way they want it to look. But at the same time, when you start having touch screens and you start being able to send it out to custom hardware controllers that are built for a specific kind of show, designing the hardware and the software and the interface around the show is something that especially when you have a show that happens over and over again, I think starts to make sense. And so I think that I'm really looking harder and harder at these, at a lot of the software-based systems. Next question.
Next one comes to us from Roscoe Jones in Madison, Indiana. Just like preamps, what do we look for in analog to digital circuits? Might this also be external for high-end workflows? Finally, what specs do we need for digital signals and recordings?
And one thing, I don't know if, this became a really big issue because right at the very beginning of COVID, the AKM fire hit, and that was basically all the analog to digital and digital to analog converters were made by one company. We learned that was probably not a good idea. And the price of these converters went from $8 a unit OEM to like $250 OEM. I mean, it was overnight, everything got really expensive. That's why a lot of us couldn't get anything for a long time, was because it wasn't because of COVID or supply chain. It was because the one manufacturer that makes like 80% of everything burned to the ground. Go ahead, Chris.
So it was a chipset factory.
Crazy.
Man, yeah, I'm sorry for anybody who tried to buy anything during that time, because I was waiting like over a year.
I mean, it really was the end. I mean, I don't think that they're making QL1s anymore, and I was told by somebody that the QL1s were never going to get updated again because because they got delayed so much, into the pipeline. They just realized by the time they turned it back on again, they'd be out of spec, and so they just decided to move on to the next thing. But it was hard, because the QL1s for us were kind of workhorses. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
So what you're talking about here, this is your A to D, and then equally there is your D to A, right? So the way that this works for anyone who doesn't understand is that you have to have something that takes analog information and turns it into ones and zeros, right? And then those ones and zeros back out into analog energy again, right? Which is essentially when it's playing out of the speaker, it is now analog again, right? When you're talking to your microphone, that's analog. The second it is captured, it's now digital information until you're hearing it physically play out again. So what your digital to analog converter is the playback, your analog to digital converter is your capture. In my own setting, the way that I have this set up is I have an interface, which is my I/O. It is my ins and outs with really, really high-end converters built into it with digital audio Denmark converters, right? This feeds 16 channels of summing. It drops down through a series of analog just circuitry and processors, and it culminates in my A to D converter, my analog to digital converter, which essentially just grabs my two-track mix and brings it back into the system, right? It then is fed out back through the Avid matrix, and that sends out to my Grace monitor controller, which has D to A built into it. So this stuff exists no matter what you're using. It has to physically exist in any of the gear that you're using. Otherwise, you would not get sound. When you're, again, this all just falls into budget. With any tech, anything, you get the best thing you can afford and you ride it until the wheels fall off, right? That's always the best thing. You just get the best thing you can and use it until it falls apart, right? And then you step up as you go. But with these things, I will say definitely the higher end you go, the more modular this gets, and it can get incredibly high end and incredibly expensive. So when you get into it, probably the Burl mothership, that's probably one of the main like systems out there that people will get, which is, it's like a channel for channel culmination of converters, and it is really pricey, but it sounds awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, go ahead, Bill, real quick.
Yeah, and I found through the course of my career, this has changed so much because once upon a time, there was only one DA converter that everybody looked for. Motorola made it. This was back in probably the 70s and 80s. Today, if you buy one of the cheap mics, what's happened is there's been a collapsing of the delta in quality. Yes, the top end is still rarefied, and it costs a lot of money to take a continuous analog waveform and sampling it so tightly that it becomes as responsive as the analog. But even the less expensive ones that we're seeing in the small ones, they've really come a long way. So that middle has more choices than it ever had before.
Go ahead, Courtney, real quick.
Yeah, I want to look at for a minimum of 24-bit and 96 kilohertz sample rate, 24-bit bit depth. Higher is better, 32 is better, and the ones that use dual A to D converters to give you 32-bit float are better, and that's what you're seeing in a lot of these things that offer the 32-bit float. They're using two D to A converters, one doing the over a certain decibel range and the rest of it doing under a certain decibel range, and then combining the two into a single 32-bit float value at whatever sample rate you set it to.
44.1 is a distribution format, not a recording format. just want to say that so that we're all there. 48 is 48 or 96 or 192 if you want to go crazy, but 48. But please, friends don't let friends record at 44.1. All right, next question.
Pedro G. Gonzalez III in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Real quick, best mixer under $1,000 US.
Lightning round. If someone said you had $1,000 to spend, I think I would probably lean towards the Allen and Heath, the one that we talked about before. I think it's the QC or the CQ or whatever would probably be the one under $1,000 that I'd probably pick. Either that or the M32. No one else raised their hand, so we'll just keep going. Go ahead, Marty, real quick. Under $1,000.
I think maybe the X32 rack, I think, can be had for just under $1,000.
No, it's like $1,600, $1,900. Yeah, you can't get there. I think the X30, the M32 would be the only thing you'd be able to. I mean, M18. I'm sorry, MR18.
The MR18, right,
Yeah,
which is the XR18 Midas version with better preamps.
Yeah, and better wiring in general. Yeah, Chris, real quick.
Actually, isn't there an Air version? Don't they?
That's the Air.
Yeah,
the X32
you never
Air.
see it.
Okay,
no. So there's the X32, which is all tablet.
No, this is like an iPad
no controls.
thing.
But then there is the X Air version, which you put a tablet on the front of it, or it has a screen similar to the CQ, but an older design.
I think that's like $800.
I've never seen one actually.
It's like $689.
Yeah, that is in that range.
That's this one right here.
There you go. Unless you don't have the iPad.
The thing that bothers me the most about the X30, the XR18s, is that the delay is defined as an FX instead of just an input delay. I don't know why that bothers my brain so much.
Yeah, there's no delay in the XRs.
It makes me so upset.
Not inputs, not output delay.
No, you can do it as an FX channel, but you can. But the fact that it's being done as an FX channel just makes me crazy. I don't know why.
It's a different delay.
So wrong. Anyway. So next question.
Next question comes to us from Craig Kudoki in Toronto. Optical-Con, MADI, BNC, Dante, AES-50, all multi-channel digital audio. Discuss the differences.
I don't think we have time to discuss all of them. The only thing I'll say is that the only one that almost everybody uses is Dante. So I mean, there's a lot of other things we can talk about, but yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Just these are protocols, and that's simply it. There's different languages, different manufacturers.
There's protocols, by the way, as a note for our council for audio. We could probably spend a whole second hour just talking about protocols, which I'd be happy to talk about. So understanding protocols and the difference between AES-67 and Dante and Ravenna and MADI and Optical-Con. That's a good second hour. Go ahead, Marty.
Yeah, the biggest difference is whether it's an Ethernet protocol or a proprietary protocol that can use Ethernet switches but not go on the network. So whether it's a layer 1, layer 2, or layer 3 digital protocol, and things like MADI and Optical-Con and AES-50, they don't go over any network devices at all. They are strictly point-to-point or point-to-multipoint within the ecosystem itself.
Next question.
Danny Grizzle in Longview, Texas. Recent Rick Beato interview with top-tier front-of-house mixer Dave Natale, who insists on analog mixers. What are the use cases in production for analog mixers? And he's got a link. Yeah,
go ahead, Chris, real quick.
Yeah, I actually just did a Rick Beato interview with Jimmy Chamberlain recently. Funny enough. But I would say for here, this is preference, okay? Some people swear by analog. Some people swear by digital. Some people like a hybrid approach of the two, and no thing is better. The only thing that matters is how the outcome is received by the crowd or the listeners, right? So it's all personal preference. And I will say my favorite engineers, like my absolute favorites, they're all completely in the box, right? But I'm here and I have a bunch of really, really premium analog stuff that I love, and it's inspiring to me, and I use it because it works. But it's just preference.
One thing that I was watching, there was a live premiere or something for mixing with the. I don't know if you haven't. Do you watch mixing? You probably don't watch mixing with the masters, but I have.
I have. Yeah. I actually like Pure Mix a lot too. Yeah, Pure Mix is amazing.
Yeah, so the mixing with the masters, I have a tendency to fall into, and they do these live premieres every once in a while, and I fell into one. And what was interesting is that they had recorded everything at the highest quality and as clean as they possibly could, and then they're pushing it out of Pro Tools into a Neve. And then they're mixing it because they can slam it. The Neve can go into, they can push things, they can do things in the Neve that they wanted to go through those preamps, but they were they recorded
the pre's.
All the pre's, and so it was a different way of. I just hadn't thought of doing it that way. And I'm sure that you have, and many people have, but it was just I hadn't thought of go ahead and mix it. Like record the most raw, the most high quality, pristine, whatever was coming out of all the instruments into Pro Tools, and then play it into the Neve, and then you can sit there and hit repeat, and and automate everything to where you want it to be. And it was funny. They were mixing an Adele, one of the big Adele hits, and it was funny. It was the person who mixed it, and he said, and he played the one that's on the record versus the one he just did for the show. And the one he did for the show was a lot better. And he was just like, he goes, that's interesting. But it's a new technology. It is news that we have more time to think about it again,
For sure. And like that's completely just like an approach. Some people, when you're in record production, you're cutting a record, a lot of people want to really, really cement those sounds in tracking.
Yeah.
So they're just right. It's hitting compressors, it's hitting EQs, it's all really, really processed and then recording. For me, I record everything raw. I always want to be able to retrieve my raw audio because there's no thing I can't go back and do after the fact. And also remember, if you record something and it's the best take ever, but it's just too compressed, you can't retrieve it. It's it's that way now. So
we're out of time. This is great. I'd like to thank Courtney for the new format. You'll notice that we've been breaking it up. So we basically, if you're wondering, a little inside baseball, which we'll talk more about on Sunday if you ask questions, but it was Courtney's suggestion. We kind of limit any opening to about 8 minutes. So it's like 8 minutes, and we're going to come out and start asking questions. So for all of you watching, that means that you throw those questions in early, and we get to it. So it's really good. So it was Courtney's idea to do this, and I think it's a great format. So thank you all to the panelists for it's so nice to have you. Chris, is our newest panelist showing up on Wednesdays, but everyone here, it's great. Marty is part of both the council and here regular, and of course Courtney and Bill add a lot to the conversation. And so a great first hour, great second hour. Thank you to the panelists. We can't do this without you. Thank you to the incredible team on the back end that is making this all happen, developing the software, managing the hardware, managing the content, actually cutting the actual show. It's a small village every single day, and we really appreciate all of your contribution. And thank you to the producers asking all these questions, keeping it all rolling. There is something about, and we're getting better now at incorporating, the chat into the show, and there's something about the hive mind that we're really tapping into where, we're getting questions from all of you, but we're also getting suggestion and answers coming in through the chat. And so more, please. That's all I got to say. More, please. So we really appreciate everything that everyone's doing, watching the show. You're really part of the show. Today, if we had walked around, the Tlaloc traversal is if we had walked around and asked these questions in person, we would have traveled 31,000 miles. That's a lot of mileage for your next United flight. 50,000 kilometers, and that is 248 million bananas for scale. All right, let's go ahead and jump into After Hours.
Are those analog bananas or digital?
We talked about that and whether there's any shrinkage in the digital bananas, because the analog, and are we using an imperial banana or a metric banana?
Depends on the bit depth,
Yeah,
quantize
exactly.
a banana. Do you lose peel?
I mean,
it loses appeal, yes.
Yeah. Yes. All right. See you, everybody. Thanks so
Good
much.
one.
Marty, great job.
Yeah,
on your
great job,
opening
Marty.
for this.
Great opening.
Wonderfully
Happy
done.
birthday, Alex.
Thank you.
Yes,
Happy birthday.
Alex.
Yes.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, break out the cake.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I
right.
forgot the
No
digital
cake.
candles.
The virtual cake.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks.